To illustrate the use of some of the ui.Dialog methods, let's run an application that uses some of them. Now in this application, we can go ahead and add a new customer by choosing the New Customer action, either from a toolbar button or from the menu. And you might notice here that when we do so, we have one of the fields, the address to field, is inactive. Now the way that this program works is that if the user enters information into the address 1 field, then and only then does the address to field become active or enabled. You may also notice that some of the buttons, the actions, are enabled and disabled according to what's happening in the program. So while we're in this input statement, some of the actions are disabled. Here we're going into a query, and notice the way that the buttons or actions enable and disable, again, according to what's happening in the program. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the code that uses those ui.Dialog methods. Starting here in the main, we can see that we open and display the form, and we go right into a multiple dialog statement, which allows us to have two different or multiple dialogues involved. We've got an input and we've got a display array. Now one of the ways that the input block is triggered is when we are adding a new customer. Now down a little farther in the main, we'll see a whole bunch of on-action statements that are managing the triggering of the actions that we've made available to the user. Now one of those is cust append, and that is triggered when we select to add a new customer. So let's take a look at the cust append function and see what it's doing. One of the things that it's doing here is making a call to the current dialog. You can see that we're setting the cust address to field to false, meaning that we want that field to not be active and be grayed out. So the dialog D is our dialog that was passed in, and d.setFieldActive says use this method on this particular field, and let's set it to be inactive. So let's just add another one here as well, and we'll just set up both when this cust append is triggered. We'll go ahead and set up both the cust address to and the cust address fields to be inactive. Now let's go back up to the main and see what happens when we are then put into our input block. So again, down here in the dialog, we've got our input block. Let's just close this out so we can take a better look. And we can see we have some various on-change control blocks and things for helping the user along. But we also have an after field. And here we've got an after field cust address. We want to set the cust address to be true or active only if they've entered some information. So if the length of that field is greater than 0, we are going to be setting that field to be active or be enabled. Now we've also added a little bit of code here to work with, where we're setting the customer address field to also be active after they leave the cust name field. Okay, so again, when we go into the dialog, initially those fields are disabled or inactive, and as they're working in the input block, we are setting them to be active. So let's run this program again and see how that works. Now, this is only being triggered when we choose the cust append action, which is this button here or in the customer's menu. Okay, so we're going to add a new customer. Notice that our two fields that we set to be inactive are shown inactive. But now if I tab out of that cust name field, the address field did become enabled and I can access it and work within it. Now if I add some data into the address field and again move out of that field, then the address to field is enabled because there was something entered in the address field. Now let's go back to the code and take a look at how these various actions are being enabled and disabled based on what's happening in the program. Now, anytime that a dialog is touched, there is a function called cust_touched passing the dialog and calling a function called cust_setup. Now, if we take a look at cust_setup, we'll see that this is the function where we are setting all the actions to be active or inactive depending on what's happening in the program. So the way that this is set up is that when this function is called, again, we're passing in the current dialog that we're in. That might be the display array, that might be the input, it might be a construct, and we are processing according to that. Now, the ui.Dialog method that's being used is setActionActive. So like setFieldActive, where we were triggering a field to be enabled or disabled or available or not, the same is true with setActionActive, but it allows an action to be enabled or disabled. And when an action is disabled, it is not only grayed out in the graphical user interface, but also any keyboard shortcut that might be associated with it is also disabled. So the action is not available when setActionActive is set to false. Now, in this program, what's happening is it's naming the action, and then it's providing a variable to determine whether that is going to be enabled or disabled. And so when this function is called, those variables have values and are able to be used. Now let's go ahead and run the program again and just again see how the actions are being enabled and disabled. Now here we're in the input and we're in a display array, so our navigation buttons and other buttons here, some are enabled, some are disabled. And when we go into various dialogues, the various actions are enabled and disabled accordingly. Now again, notice with an action being disabled, it is also disabled in any other place that it might be represented, again, including any keyboard shortcut associated with it. By referencing the documentation, you can find out more about the dialog class and all of the various methods that are available. The documentation shows the method name, as well as the arguments needed, a description, and then you can select the individual method and get more information about it.